I was younger, I felt like every few years there was some kind of major media franchise, some book to movie franchise that just took the world by storm. Twilight, Hunger Games, but not even just in the young adult space. There was Game of Thrones. There was also Game of Thrones, and then there was Game of Thrones, and also Game of Thrones, and I guess Lord of the Rings. Oh, and Game of Thrones. But I feel like these days there just aren't book to movie adaptations that are doing what those book to movie adaptations did back in the day. But I'm fallible. You know what I mean? I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a get off my lawn, back in my day it was better than it is now, kids these days suck sort of situation. So when I first started making my series about the Hunger Games way back like a year and a half ago maybe now, part of my goal was to figure out why these book series from the past had been so popular, why the movie adaptations had done so well, and why that does not seem to be happening anymore, at least based off of what I see in the media. But imagine my surprise when I sat down to make those videos and I found out that there is merit to that feeling. By the time the first Hunger Games movie came out 4 years after publishing, the first copy of the book series alone had sold 17.5 million copies. 17.5 million. That is crazy. The entire ACOTAR series to date has only sold 13 million copies. The reason I use ACOTAR as an example is because Sarah J. Maas was the most sold author of last year. So her books are a pretty good representation for how literature is selling in the present day. In fact, I would argue it's too good a representation. If she's the best-selling author that there is, then she's selling the most books out of anybody else. So if her whole entire most popular series has only sold 13 million copies, and the first Hunger Games book sold 17.5 million in the first 4 years after it was released, you see what I mean? That's just the first book too, against the entire series. To date, the Hunger Games series has sold 100 million copies worldwide. But this video isn't about the Hunger Games. This video is about Divergent. Divergent is another young adult dystopian. It came out a few years after the Hunger Games, but it's often compared to the Hunger Games because it's also a dystopian, and there are other similarities which we will get into talking to eventually. But Divergent, as of today, has sold 35 million copies. Sarah J. Maas's entire bibliography has sold 38 million copies. And in case you don't like Sarah J. Maas, Brandon Sanderson, his entire bibliography has also sold around 37 million. So the Divergent series alone has sold the same amount of copies as Brandon Sanderson's entire bibliography, and also as Sarah J. Maas's entire bibliography. Not put together, they're basically all even. So it's not just my feeling. Book series aren't selling like they used to, and the movie adaptations are not really busting the block like they used to. So I had originally set out to reread a lot of these popular young adult series from my childhood in order to make videos on them. I got a little distracted when I was talking about Twilight because there's just so much to unpack with the Twilight series. So I didn't really focus on why it was popular. We more just were peeling back the many layers that exist over that book series. By the way, I know I still have to do Midnight Sun. It's missing from my shelf, so that's my proof I'm working on it. You'll just have to be patient, but I promise that it's worth it. So what better series to get us back on track of my journey of figuring out why these book series were so popular and why they did so well than with Divergent. Divergent is a young adult dystopian book series that has 3 books and 1 set of novellas. They came out from 2011 to 2013, and then the movies came out from 2014 to 2016. Now, do not be fooled. There were 3 books and 3 movies, but they did not actually finish the movie franchise. What? They tried to do the whole split the last book into 2 movies thing. Not every finale of a book series merits that. The 3rd movie did not do so well at the box office, and by did not do so well, I mean grossed $160 million worldwide. So that just goes to show you how much money they were expecting this movie to make, that $160 million was considered a disappointment by the studio. And they announced that they were instead going to do the 4th movie as a TV release, as opposed to a theatrical release. The cast wasn't thrilled about this, the fans weren't thrilled about this, and in 2018 they announced, you know what, we're just not going to make the movie, we're going to leave it the 3 movies, and we're never going to finish the story. Shout out Screen Rant. I will link an article in the description that talks about that whole situation a lot more in depth. So the Divergent series never got finished because the studio thought that the movie tanked or like didn't perform as well as they wanted it to, and they didn't think it was going to end up being financially worth it to invest all that in another theatrical release for the final movie. And that was kind of the last of these really popular young adult adult series that got turned into major movie franchises, and it just hasn't really been as much of a thing since. So a lot of people consider Divergent to be the series that killed the young adult book to movie adaptation genre. Now, I never think things are this simple. Just because Divergent was the last one and it was a little bit of a failure towards the end doesn't mean that it's what killed the genre. It probably scared studios off, but I feel like we end up on this cycle where some type of movie, for lack of a better way to put it, ends up being a really safe bet for studios, pulls in a lot of viewers for whatever reason, and so then they just make movie after movie after movie after movie with that sort of premise because it's so reliable to them, and then they eventually find that they made so many movies that people are kind of tired of seeing them, and it really wears out the fan base. And then they end up deciding just never to make movies like that again, because God forbid we invest in something that might fail. As the young adult book to movie adaptation was fading out, what was fading in were like the mostly Marvel. I mean, DC has tried to make movies, but it hasn't really worked. Those superhero movies were just dominated for a really long time, and that's what everybody was making. And now it's nostalgia content. Now they're just kind of like remaking things that were popular before because they're finding that that is what is performing now. But people are starting to get tired of that, so I am very curious to see what the next big movie trend is going to be, especially because the cycle seems to be speeding up, much like all trend cycles are kind of speeding up right now, so we'll see. But all of that to say that I don't individually blame Divergent for killing the young adult book to movie thing, but part of the reason why people think that is because fans of the books didn't think that the movies were the best adaptation of the books. In fact, when I was hunting around to see if I could find the movie for free to watch, okay, all right, don't sue me, I found multiple Reddit threads of people that were like, yeah, you can watch it here, but don't. Fans of the series being like, yeah, don't, just read the books. The movies aren't good representations. So it's a widely held belief amongst the fan base that the movies were not a good representation of the books. It's crazy because they were worried about the performance of the movies too, but they had Zoe Kravitz and Miles Teller in them. And I'm trying to imagine, like, if they now, in the year 2025, tried to put out this fourth Divergent movie and it had Zoe Kravitz and Miles Teller in it, I feel like it would crush at the box office. That's just my opinion. I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know if anyone would have any interest in the fourth Divergent movie, but I just feel like if they went back and made it now with the same cast, they might have success where they thought maybe they weren't going to in the past due to the star power. Divergent is also often remembered as a Hunger Games knockoff, an opinion I myself held, mostly just because that's what I was told. If I'm being completely real with you, I didn't remember anything specific about the books to make me think that. I just know that's kind of what people think about it. I mentioned that to my sister once in passing, and I got a stern talking to. Turns out my sister was a massive fan of these books and movies, and she was very much like, it's not a Hunger Games knockoff. I don't know why you would say that. I don't know why anyone says that. It's completely different, blah, 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 blah. And she went on this whole rant. So we're going to be answering two questions today. Is the movie a good adaptation of the book? And is the book a copy of the Hunger Games? I would say enough preamble, but that wasn't really, this is a video essay. I'm presenting an essay to you. So that was my first few paragraphs about the history of young adult media, the book to movie franchises, and the fan reaction to the books and the movies that I'm talking about. And now we're going to actually talk about the book. I'm just throwing that asterisk in there for those of you that tell me I need to get to the point quicker, because sorry I don't get to the thoughts on the book as quickly. It's because I'm setting up the essay. Anyway, let's talk about the premise. Divergent takes place in a post-apocalyptic Chicago. Don't worry, guys, the bean survived. Though, Lake Michigan is completely dried up. You win some, you lose some. The city is now a completely contained society. It's got walls around it, kind of blocks out the outside world, and it's split into 5 factions. Each faction has one core character trait that is considered the most important character trait to that faction, and is the thing they prioritize above all else and kind of hold above all else. The factions and their related character traits are Dauntless, which is bravery, Erudite, which is knowledge, Abnegation, which is selflessness, Candor, which is honesty, and Amity, which is peace. These factions all have specific roles in the society based off of whatever character trait they prioritize. So the Dauntless are the brave ones, and they're the army / the police. The Erudite are the smart ones, and they're like the researchers and the tech people. Abnegation are the selfless ones, and so they run the government, and they do a bunch of charity work for the people people that they call the factionless, which is essentially just the word for homelessness in this universe. People who don't belong to any one faction, and so they're just kind of like out on the street. Abnegation, because they are the selfless ones, they volunteer to help the factionless, and they run the government, because supposedly because they are the selfless ones and they prioritize selflessness above all else, they're uncorruptible because they won't be making decisions for their own personal gain, is the theory, right? Candor are the lawyers, which is probably the most fascinating faction to me, simply because it's essentially never mentioned. I don't know why they need lawyers. Nobody ever talks about anybody suing anybody, and nobody ever gets arrested over the course of this book series, so I don't really know what the lawyers are there for, but Candor are the lawyers. And Amity are the peaceful ones, and they are the farmers/doctors. Every year, once a year, all the kids who turn 16 in that past year take this test where they inject them with a serum that puts them into a hallucination. They call it a simulation, but it's a hallucination, basically. And through that test, they are then recommended a specific faction. They don't have to pick the faction they're recommended. The test is just supposed to tell them what faction they think they would best fit into, but they don't have to listen to what the test says. Then the following day, they have what's called the choosing ceremony, where everybody chooses their faction. They're all raised in faction, so their parents raise them in whatever faction their parents are a part of, but this is the day they can choose to leave their faction if they want and join a different one, but you only get to choose once. And if you don't end up fitting in with your new faction, if you don't make it through initiation, then you will end up factionless. That's how a lot of people end up factionless. So most people end up staying in their faction because it's just what they know, what they're comfortable with, and genetically, if it's what you're raised in and it's what your parents value the most, then you'd be raised with those values. And so a lot of people end up just kind of naturally fitting into the faction they were raised into. But that's not always the case. And sometimes at the choosing ceremony, the kids choose to join a different faction. This is widely viewed as abandoning your family. It's called defecting. And as much as the kids are encouraged to do it if they feel like it's what's best for them, it does seem to be relatively frowned upon, or it's viewed as reflecting poorly on the parents of the student or on the faction that they left. And they're only allowed to choose the once, and once they choose, they can't take it back. That's your faction now. It's unclear how much the factions intermingle, and this is actually one of my complaints about this book from the world building perspective. I was kind of under the impression from the way the book was written that it's relatively uncommon for the factions to intermingle, but they do kind of talk about being at school together, so I think all the different kids from all the different factions go to school together, and I guess a lot of these jobs would have to interact and people know each other, but then it's often talked about how it's like faction over blood, and if they see you interacting with your old faction, they might be suspicious about your loyalty to this faction, and you certainly shouldn't seek out your family because that'll make them suspicious that you're not as loyal to your faction as you are to your family. So it's kind of confusing, like how much they are allowed to interact with other factions, or if it's more just frowned upon to interact with your old faction or your old family. It's just not exactly clear to me how welcome interacting in general between the factions is, or like if it's just that you shouldn't go back to your old one. Anyway, we meet our main character just as she's about to go through the test to find out what faction they're going to recommend to her. So she is 16 years old. Her name at this point in time is Beatrice. She will eventually go by Triss. So if you're confused by the fact that I'm calling her Beatrice in the beginning, I'm trying to stick to canon. At this point in time in the book, she was called Beatrice. Now that we've gotten through the premise, I do have to say, I see where the Hunger Games comparisons come in. I'm sorry, I do. I will say, even though we haven't really gotten to the plot yet, that from a plot perspective, from like a character perspective, from like basically everything else about the book, I don't really think it's comparable to the Hunger Games. So I do not think it's like a knockoff, nor do I think that the author was intentionally copying the Hunger Games. However, once you really think about the premise, it's really easy to see why people get reminded of the Hunger Games, beyond just them both being young adult dystopian. The premise, the world building of this society, the setup of this universe is essentially a mini of the universe within the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games takes place in post-apocalyptic America. Divergent takes place in a post-apocalyptic Chicago. The Hunger Games has 12 districts all across America that all produce different goods. You're born into a district, you stay in that district your whole life, and your entire life is essentially dictated by the district that you're in. You get a job producing whatever product it is, and how wealthy you are and how well you are treated by the capital also depends on what district you're from. In Divergent, they have 5 factions, and each faction has specific roles and specific jobs, and you see the comparison. You're born into it, you're raised into it. There's a difference here in that you can choose to switch, but there isn't a ton of intermingling, and they're really like split up into categories, and each of those categories is like related to what job you're going to end up having within the society. There's a lot of similarity to the setups of these books. Now, because it's just the setup, I am not like, I personally do not think this is an intentional copy of the Hunger Games, nor do I really think it's an accidental copy of it. The idea that a society is split up this distinctly is not really a new thing. A lot of dystopians involve some kind of like you're, split, categorized, assigned jobs, told what your personality is, whatever it might be. So I don't think this is like unique to the Hunger Games. Therefore, I do not think that Divergent necessarily copied the Hunger Games in doing it. The series is by Veronica Roth, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. So I don't necessarily think Veronica Roth was copying Suzanne Collins. And especially because basically nothing else about the books is similar, I'm like especially don't think that's the case. But also, I don't think people are just saying that because they're both dystopians that were popular in a similar time frame. I do think that there are similarities between the universe and like the setups of these stories that make just the tiniest bit of sense to me why people say that Divergent feels like a knockoff of the Hunger Games, especially because it never got quite as popular. Oh, and they also both feature a 16-year-old girl as their main character, that it goes from a peaceful life to a life of training and fighting. So there is that similarity as well, but not in the same way. Katniss and Triss are not similar characters, and they don't go through similar experiences. And with that, let's dive into the plot and my thoughts on the book itself. So I did read this, I think, at one point in time, and I certainly watched the movies. I know I watched the movies. I believe I read the books because I was a bit of a Puritan about that back then. I will admit to you, I do not have very strong memory of reading the books, and most of my memory of this series is from watching the movies. That being said, I remembered very little about the whole thing. So when the main character was introduced to me as Beatrice, I thought she was going to be Beatrice the whole entire book. And I was a little bit like, what a name for a main character. No hate if your name is Beatrice. It's just not the most like exciting name for the main character of a young adult dystopian. So I thought it was a little bit of an interesting choice, but she does end up changing it later on. So she doesn't go by Beatrice for the majority of the book. The test is very interesting. It introduces this idea of these simulations to the reader. So they kind of go into these hallucinations, but it's important to note that they can be monitored from the outside. So there is a tester standing there that can view what you're seeing inside your head, even though it's all happening inside your head. So this test is supposed to tell Beatrice what faction she belongs to. It's supposed to tell her who she is. And she's excited for this because she grew up in Abnegation, which is the selflessness faction, and she's never really felt like she belonged there. She doesn't really feel naturally selfless. Her brother Caleb is a lot more natural in Abnegation fit than she is, and she's always really struggled with all the rules and the things they're supposed to do within Abnegation, and she doesn't 100% feel like she belongs. And so she's very excited to take the test because she's excited to find out what faction they think she belongs in, because she's suspicious that it might not be Abnegation. However, when she takes the test, she finds out that she's a secret sixth thing called Divergent. She doesn't belong in one of the 5 factions. No. She could be in one of 3 of them. She equally belongs to Dauntless, Erudite, and Abnegation. So she is brave and smart and selfless. The tester immediately freaks out and is like, I'm going to manually enter the result of your test as Abnegation. I'm going to tell them there was a problem with the test. I'm going to tell them the serum made you sick, and I'm going to send you home. Do not tell anybody that you got this result. It's called Divergent, but don't ever say that word to anybody. Pretend like you don't know what it is if you ever hear somebody say it. You are Divergent, but don't ever tell anybody that. Good luck at the choosing ceremony. And Beatrice is like, what? I've never even heard of this Divergent thing. What are you talking about? And the lady's just like, don't tell anyone about it, and shoves her out the door. So she's confused by this whole thing and really left to wonder what faction she should choose. And the next day at the choosing ceremony, her brother, like I said, she really views him as a natural fit for Abnegation. So it's very surprising to her when he ends up choosing Erudite, which is the knowledge faction. He chooses Erudite right before her. So then she feels this extra pressure to stay in Abnegation with her parents so that they don't lose both of their children. But right at the last minute, she decides to go with Dauntless instead. And so her parents, who I think I forgot to mention, but her dad is like a council member within Abnegation. So he actually like works in the government as one of the leaders. So both of their children ended up defecting from the abnegation faction, which you can imagine does not really reflect super great on the faction or the family. But I digress. She chooses to be dauntless, and these are the brave people. She has to jump on a train, then she has to jump off a train onto the roof, and then she has to jump off a roof down 7 stories into a net, and all of it is a big test of bravery right up front. But she was the first jumper down into the pit, and this ends up being a really big deal. Being the first jumper kind of like gives you this, what's it called? Like she has a little bit of swag almost, right? Like, I was the first jumper, I was the bravest of all the new recruits. The initiates are separated as Dauntless born versus people who switched, and there are a bunch of people who switched. So it's made out to be a really big deal that Beatrice did, but like a lot of people seem to do it, so it's not like she was the only one who did. And they're split up for the training. So she meets a few friends right here. She meets Al, she meets Christina. Christina is Zoe Kravitz, if you were wondering. She also meets people she doesn't like, such as Peter, which is Miles Teller. When she lands in the net as she's getting out, a gorgeous man helps her out of the net and asks her what her name is. And this is when she decides to go by Triss instead of Beatrice. So from here on out, we are going to be calling her Triss, but we're still talking about the same girl, the same main character. This gentleman introduces himself as Four. So I didn't set up, I should have, I'm sorry. But before Beatrice like goes through this whole process, we find out that their head council person, like basically the president of this society, his name is Marcus. And there were rumors that his son defected a few years back because he mistreated his son, and the son was named Tobias. Now, maybe it's because I'm an adult, and I'm an adult reading a young adult fiction, and I try to keep that as at the forefront of my mind when I'm reading these books, okay? I like literally immediately knew that Four was going to be Tobias. Like the second he introduced himself as Four, and you know, it obviously being a nickname and people like talking about it being a nickname, it was like, yeah, okay, that's Tobias. Like that's going to end up being Tobias, and I was right about that. But it is a young adult novel, so I don't know how obvious that would be to a kid. It was obvious to me, but I'm a grown woman. In the book, they did it different. In the movie, don't you get mad at me. Sometimes you guys get mad at me and it's just because the book was different from the movie. This is different, okay? The Dauntless training, the first round, is just physical. It's just fighting. The second round is all mental. It's all going into these simulations and facing your fears. And then the third round is supposed to be kind of a combination of the physical and the mental rounds. And people are cut at the end of the first round and at the end of the third round. And if you are cut from the initiation, then you end up factionless. So you really don't want to be at the bottom of the rankings at the end of the first round and the end of the third round. In the movie, they just cut it down to 2 rounds. Makes sense. I don't really care about that change. I just wanted to make sure you know I'm getting my facts correct, okay? Don't get mad at me just because it's different from what happens in the movie. Triss has a really hard time with the physical challenges. She is very small. This is remarked upon quite frequently throughout the book series, is just how small she really is. She's an itty bitty little girl. The way she thinks at times bothers me through this early training. I know part of the point is that she's not supposed to be a selfless person, so I don't know if this was an intentional thing by the author or if the author was just kind of roping their feelings in. But her friend Al is this really like big guy, but he's a little bit of a coward, and she very much thinks of him very negatively because of this. She also has a lot of like relatively fat phobic thoughts and like judgmental thoughts towards other people. She's just like not the nicest. And I guess she wasn't, like when she got her Divergent results, she wasn't told that she belonged in Amity, and Amity are supposed to be the super like peaceful, kind ones. She's selfless, which is a different thing. Selflessness and kindness are different. So I don't know if it was like an intentional character choice or if it's more just a marker of the time, because at the time things like fat phobia weren't nearly as frowned upon as they are now. So I don't know if these aspects of Triss's character were intentional to show like, hey, she's not that kind, or if it's the author kind of letting some of their feelings about the world trickle through. Not 100% sure, but I just wanted to tell you that there were points where Triss's train of thought kind of bothered me. I'm like, I don't really love the way you're thinking about this person right now. It feels a little rude. Triss's mom visits her on, they have like visiting day or whatever. That's a few weeks after they start the initiation where their parents can come and visit. And her mom comes to visit, not her dad. And she finds out from her mom that her mom used to be Dauntless and that her mom is aware of Divergence and that her mom is suspicious of the fact that Triss might be Divergent. And her mom kind of emphasizes the stuff that she got from Tori, who actually is Dauntless, so she's able to interact with Tori a couple more times too through the training. And both of them keep telling her being Divergent is super dangerous. They will kill you if they know, so you have to keep it a secret. They do not want people to be Divergent. This is such a small thing, but on 288, page 288, I mean, it very specifically remarks she like ends up crashing in Four's room Ooh. But he sleeps on the floor and she ends up sleeping on top of the quilt. And it's just like, it's specifically mentioned and I don't really know why. I always find those things to be so interesting. Like the author went out of their way to mention that she slept on top of the quilt. So that's something that's important to know about Triss, I guess. So the first round of training is physical. And like I said, Triss really struggles with this, but she is able to show her bravery. She's very, very brave. And 4 kind of takes a liking to her and starts helping her a little bit and giving her advice on how to like use her size to her advantage. And she ends up defeating somebody near the end of the fighting that kind of raises her up out of the rankings of people who ended up getting cut. Then the second round of their training is they go through these simulations and they have to face their fears. And when she's in these simulations, Triss, at some point in both of them in the beginning, is able to kind of figure out that she's in a simulation and manipulate it a little bit and get herself kind of out of trouble of whatever's happening in the simulation. And so the second time she like comes to from these simulations, 4 is like, "You're Divergent." And she's like, "How did you know that?" And he's like, "You can't tell anybody." And he specifically tells her, and I went back to check this because I ended up being so confused, but he very specifically tells her that her understanding that she is in a simulation and manipulating it is a sign that she is Divergent. So this is the thing that she needs to hide. And through the rest of her simulations, it's at least described to us that she is figuring out how to like hide the fact that she's able to manipulate the visions. Now, this might be something that confuses you. If you were a fan of the movies, this is not how they do it in the movie because, and this bothered me so much, so that's why I'm going to talk about it. When she does her final test, her final fear landscape is what they call, and she has to face all of her worst fears and people are watching her, in the book, she manipulates those visions so much throughout the whole entire thing in a way that would be really, really obvious to somebody watching it. She's just like pulling weapons out of places and inventing doors and passages for her to get out of things and cracking glass she shouldn't be able to crack. And it's really confusing because it's really hammered into her head. You have to hide the fact that you're Divergent. The visions are the most dangerous part of the simulations, whatever they're called. And in these simulations, you cannot give away the fact that you are Divergent. So you have to just like sit in them and like not manipulate them, even though you understand that you're in a simulation. And then for her final test, all she does is manipulate it, and afterwards everyone's like, great job, you're like the top candidate, you're number 1, dude. And it was such a massive plot hole that it actually threw me so much. Like the whole time she's doing this test, I was like, oh my god, she's gonna get in so much trouble when she gets out. They're gonna know she's Divergent. And then she gets out of the test and everybody's just like, good job, great work. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Did you not just watch her manipulate all those visions? Is that not supposed to be like the big sign that she's Divergent? Like, what are we talking about? So that's where I'm saying I went back and I checked, and I am 100% sure that that's what 4 told her, that the ability to manipulate the visions is what marks her as Divergent. So I don't know, dude. But in the movie, they ended up just saying that like the decisions she was making in the visions were like what was marking her as Divergent, and 4 kind of trains her to react in a specifically a dauntless way so that they think that she's dauntless instead of reacting the way a Divergent would react, is like the way that they did it in the movie. Her and 4 end up like DTRing and calling themselves boyfriend and girlfriend, which I did think was really funny because they basically kissed once and then Triss was like, yeah, he's my boyfriend, which is like very teen love of them. So I did like adore that part. I thought it was really cute and very sweet. It was like, oh yeah, you did kiss, so I guess you are boyfriend and girlfriend. That is how it works. And I wish life were still that simple. Another thing I want to shout out that I actually think is really, really great about this part of this book is that in a lot of young adult novels, they either pretend like sex doesn't exist, or it's like very loosely hinted at that the characters eventually have sex, but it's like very, very brushed over. This book does not only directly mention sex and actually use the word sex, but Triss is somewhat afraid of intimacy, and intimacy actually shows up in her fear landscape with 4 specifically. So 4 shows up in her fear landscape and she's like afraid of having sex with him, even though she's attracted to him. And I love, because that's so accurate to how so many teenagers, myself included, felt about intimacy before we'd ever experienced it, right? I really appreciated the fact that it was a young adult novel that was not afraid to like mention sex or the fact that sex exists, and even to just like use the word overtly, but to approach it in a way that actually is relatable for teens, and to have this teen girl be afraid of becoming intimate with this guy that she has a really big crush on, and just to have this be something that makes her nervous. Like, I just think it's really realistic, and I actually really, really loved it as a choice. It was probably my favorite choice in the whole book. I think it was really, really great. And so I really want to compliment Veronica Roth on that, because I think it's bold to even mention sex directly in general in a YA, but to do it in a way that I think is so approachable and relatable for teens. Really, really smart, really great. She also does find out that 4 is Tobias. So like I said, I kind of figured that out at the beginning of the book, but that is revealed more in them being like romancy with each other and stuff. So after the final test that I personally don't think she should have passed, I think they should have figured her out, but whatever. After the test, they're like, oh, you're officially a Dauntless, you're initiated now, and they inject them with the serum that they say has a tracker in it for if they get lost when they're out on missions and stuff. And cool, she's a Dauntless now. And then she goes back to the dorms to go to sleep, and while she's asleep, she wakes up in the middle of the night to all the other Dauntless just kind of like getting up and getting dressed, and she doesn't really know what's going on, so she just like gets up and gets dressed with them. And at one point she really looks at one of them and she figures out that they're a little bit in a zombie mode, and she puts a bunch of pieces together really quickly. There had been rumors this whole time that Erudite was planning on some kind of overthrow of the government. Those are the smart people. They kept putting out all these essays saying that they didn't think that Abnegation was doing a good job running the government. And so there was kind of these rumblings that they were going to like attempt an overthrow of the government, but no one was that scared because they're the smart people. They don't fight. But the smart people came up with this like version of the simulation serum that basically makes all the Dauntless people into mindless zombies so that they will do the fighting for Erudite. So all of the Dauntless are kind of like in this zone, in this mode where they're not really like thinking for themselves and they're just kind of following orders. So she figures this all out shockingly quickly. I think part of me feels like enough of it was foreshadowed that it made sense, but part of me also feels like she figured it out very, very quickly and immediately knew that she had to also pretend to be a zombie or they were going to find out she was Divergent. Because she also figures out that that's probably why they didn't want any Divergence, because then the serum wouldn't work on them because they understand they're in a simulation. So however their brain works makes it so that the serum doesn't really work on them. So she goes along and basically pretends to be a part of this whole zombie army until she finds Tobias. She calls him Tobias at this point. Turns out that Tobias is also Divergent, and that's why he knew what Divergent was. And so he also isn't under the spell of the serum. They get to the Abnegation area where all the Abnegation people live, and her and Tobias split off from the group to try and find her family and then run away. And they're almost immediately caught, which I appreciate because I feel like that's super realistic. Basically, as soon as they split off from the group, everybody's like, wait, you're not a zombie. And then they end up having to kind of like fight their way away. Triss is injured, so they take Tobias, but they just leave her in a tank. They're trying to like drown her. This is from her Fear landscape. I don't think it makes a ton of sense for them to have done this IRL, but whatever, it's a book. She ends up breaking out of the tank. Or does she break out of the tank? Guys, I don't remember. I don't think it matters though. She doesn't die there. And she ends up getting away and she finds her mom. Triss's dad and her brother and Marcus are all hiding out somewhere, and her mom are trying to get there. Her mom dies on the way there saving Triss. And so by the time Triss gets to where her dad and brother are, her mom is dead, unfortunately. And then they're like, we need to run to Amity and see if they'll take us in because they're all about peace. And so I don't think they'll attack us and I don't think they'll turn us in. But she's like, well, but they're going to kill all the other Abnegation people if we don't stop them. So we've got to get back to the Dauntless control to figure out where they're like controlling everybody from and shut it all down. And they're like, okay, fine, we'll go with you. So her dad, her brother, and then Marcus, who, if you remember, was Tobias's dad, who's also like the leader of Abnegation. We also do get confirmation that Tobias was mistreated by him, and that is why Tobias left Abnegation. So they go to the whole Divergent headquarters and they find Peter, who tells them where all the computers are in exchange for them taking him with them when they leave. And so they agree to this, even though she hates Peter. And they find the control room. They find the area, and on the way to the control room, her dad actually also passes away, unfortunately. So it's just her and her brother and Marcus, and she makes it to the control room. She finds Tobias, but Tobias is under the spell of some like different simulation serum, and so he doesn't recognize her, and he still tries to kill her because he sees her as a threat because he doesn't realize who she is. And at the end of their fight, she is about to basically let him shoot her because she can't bring herself to kill him, even though he's trying to kill her in this moment. And right before he's about to shoot her, he kind of like wakes up and realizes what he's doing and helps her fight all the other guards, and then they're able to shut down the whole simulation thing and wake up all the Dauntless people. And they do remember, it seems as though they kind of remembered what they did leading up to everything, so it seems like all the Dauntless people know what Erudite did, although that's not 100% clear at this point in time, at least in the book. And the book ends with Triss, Tobias, her brother Caleb, Marcus, and Peter all leaving to escape to Amity in hopes that they will take them in and not turn them in to Erudite, which is also also strange because you think if the Dauntless are mad about the way that they were controlled, that Erudite wouldn't be able to like continue this war, but I don't know. I guess we'll see where the second book goes. But anyway, that's the book. I skipped one tiny little thing that stuck out to me through this whole battle sequence. There's a point where Triss's mom is explaining to her what divergence is, and she says, this is so funny, sorry. Our minds move in a dozen different directions. We can't be confined to one way of thinking, and that terrifies our leaders. It means we can't be controlled, and it means no matter what they do, we will always cause trouble for them. And when I read that, but our minds move in a dozen different directions, I had a moment where I was like, it kind of sounds like she's talking about ADHD. Look at the title of the book. I was covering it. Look at the title of the book. I don't know how it was not until the end of this book that I realized that Divergent was supposed to be neurodivergent. That's on me, you guys. That's on me. I have never felt so stupid in my life. I was like, how did I not pick up on that? How did I not? It's literally called Divergent. And the whole time they're like, oh, these people, they're divergent. They're divergent. They're divergent in the head. Some might call that neurodivergent. Almost as if that's a thing we have IRL. Neurodivergent is an umbrella that contains underneath it a set of, would disorders be the right word? It's just like different ways your brain can be wired that are not the norm. And so there's this word that kind of separates neurotypical from neurodivergent. The most well-known neurodivergents are ADHD and autism, although bipolar also falls under that umbrella, as well as certain forms of PTSD and others, I think. Those are just the four I know off the top of my head. But all of it just basically means like your brain is wired in a way that is different from the norm. First of all, I don't know how I made it to the end of the book before I realized that's what she is doing. And second, I don't know how I feel about this. On one hand, I find it hilarious to imply that people with ADHD and autism are difficult to control. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty easy to control if you hand me a fidget toy, you know? Like, I have ADHD, just in case you were wondering, but I do think it's pretty obvious. So yeah, on one hand, I'm torn on the whole ADHD, autism as a metaphor here, but also the implication that all neurotypical people are easy to control and like fall into these nice little categories and all perfectly align with these personality traits. Like, I don't know. There was part of me that was like, oh, do I love this? I get it in concept. I get it in theory because myself included, a lot of kids with ADHD or autism grow up feeling very different and kind of ousted from society. And so I like the idea of some kind of story that not just implies but actually directly states that neurodivergence like that is a bit of a superpower. And also there is something to be said for the fact that when you are neurodivergent, but I'm just speaking from my own experience, I guess I shouldn't be speaking for the club here. I have ADHD, and I certainly have at a lot of points in my life kind of felt like everybody got handed a pamphlet that nobody gave me, and all the other kids just like knew everything they were supposed to do, and it was a bunch of stuff that no one told me about, but everybody just like expected me to know. And when you're in that as a kid, then I think it could very much feel to a child like neurotypicals are this like big blob of like groupthink, and all of them all just kind of like follow the way society should be, and those of us who are neurodivergent just like don't get to be in that special little club. So I kind of get like with the faction thing and the fact that the people with ADHD or autism, it's implied, don't fit into this whole faction system and they don't just like go along with the way society is. Like, I do think it makes sense, but is it taking it a little far to then just say that like all neurotypical people can fall into these nice little categories? I don't know, because it's also a young adult, so if it's supposed to be representative for how young neurodivergent kids feel, then I feel like it would be, but I don't know that it's the best to like further emphasize that. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm taking my media too seriously, maybe I'm thinking about it like way too hard. I'm gonna go on like a side rant here, and it might not seem like this is relevant, but I promise it is. I actually really don't like stories like this. I was trying to kind of dance around it, but I've decided to just be honest with you guys. I do not like the whole Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, like, your differences could be the things that make you special and unique, because the implication to me with that has always been your differences are only acceptable to society if they make you useful. So if you have things that make you different from society in a way that like benefits society, then you're accepted, because even though you're not the same as everybody else, you have these traits that people can get something out of, and so you are accepted. But when people are weird in a way that doesn't benefit other people, then they often are still ousted from society. Like, it's only okay to be different as long as your differences are useful, and once you're different in a way that isn't benefiting anybody around you and is just you being a little bit different, but isn't necessarily hurting anybody around you either, it's just you being a little bit different, like, those people tend to still be ousted from society. Like, it's interesting because when I was a young kid, I used to love the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie, because in the movie they had the Island of Misfit Toys, and I very much as a kid felt like I was from the Island of Misfit Toys as well, and so I felt very like seen by that movie, and I liked that story because I liked it talking about these people that were different. But even kid me had like moments watching that movie where it's like, yeah, everybody was mean to Rudolph until he was useful. And in this circumstance, it's like, I don't know that it's exactly the same, but it's like divergence isn't accepted into this society until it's useful and until it stops them from being brainwashed by the serum, and so they're able to like fight back against the rebellion in the way that the neurotypical people aren't, because they were given the serum. I just once would like to see a story where it's like someone's different and they just like get accepted for the way that they are, and it's not because they're like useful, and it's not because they like offer something, but it's just because if somebody's not hurting anybody else, then what does it matter if they don't exactly fit into how a human being should be? Like, what does it even mean for like a human being to like should be a certain way? You know what I'm saying? And I'm just like personally a little bit exhausted by these stories of it just being like, oh, this person's different, and then they were ousted and they had these bad experiences and everybody hated them and everyone was mean to them, but then they ended up being the hero at the end of the day because they were the one that was different, and so they were able to do something that everybody else like wasn't able to do. It's like, well, why couldn't they have just been nice to them because it's important to be nice? Like, why couldn't they have just accepted them because we should accept everybody as a society? And so that's why it's like, I was very like thrown off by this realization, and it kind of made me feel different about the book in hindsight, because I was like, it's just another one of those stories. I don't know. I get it, but I don't. And I could see how someone would feel seen by it, but I mean, I certainly didn't pick up on this when I was a young neurodivergent kid. So I didn't get that message when I was a kid, but I also wasn't really in the demographic for it when it came out. I was a little bit older. So I don't know. Have you guys read this? Did you read it when you were a kid? Did you feel accepted and seen by it? Did you even pick up on the fact that Divergent is supposed to be neurodivergent? Do you think it's not that? And do you think I'm just like jumping to these crazy conclusions because of the title of the book and the one line in there that kind of explained what divergence is? Let me know. That's how I felt upon finishing it. I'm just kind of exhausted by these stories, and I don't know how useful and helpful they actually are to young children. Let's just let everybody be the way that they are if they're not hurting anybody. Crazy take, I know. And all of that to say, 45 minutes deep into a video essay about Divergent, I feel like if you're still watching, it's safe for me to tell you this. I did still feel a little bit special at the thought that the serum wouldn't work on me. Serum wouldn't work on me, you guys. I wouldn't turn into a zombie. I'm special. So I don't know, maybe it is doing something for kids with that. But now let's talk about my thoughts on the book kind of like overarchingly. I do think it's incredibly relatable to teens in general, not just the part about the fear of intimacy. They all just get tattoos all the time, which I feel like is something teens think are cool, or at least they did when I was a teenager. I thought tattoos were cool. I still don't have any. Teen me would be disappointed to know I'm 26 with no tattoos, but here we are. There's parts where Triss is talking about not feeling like she belongs with her family that I think are also very relatable, or I don't know if it's supposed to relate to neurodivergent kids. Maybe I just found them to be relatable to how I felt as a teen because I am neurodivergent. Who knows? And also like the feeling of like I'm not good enough. This video is turning into a therapy session for me, you guys. I'm starting to wonder if I just related to it because I was a neurodivergent teen once, but I found it to be relatable. I at many points in this book I thought, oh, this would be relatable to teenagers because I felt that way when I was a teenager. I don't know if it would be generally relatable to all teenagers or if I just felt that way because she was writing for ADHD kids. So maybe my whole Rudolph comparison was unfair. I don't know. There were points in it where I felt it was very relatable. However, my big criticism for this book, the writing itself, like the actual writing of the words, very choppy, very hard to read. Now, here's the thing. I don't know how normal this is for the young adult genre. I don't read young adult that often. I read it a lot when I was a young adult. These days, I pretty much only read young adult for the channel. And the two series that I did up until now are The Hunger Games and Twilight, which are widely considered some of the best young adult books ever. I mean, regardless of if you personally respect Twilight as a book series, it was incredibly popular for a reason. And one of the things I said about it as I was talking about it is that the books themselves are actually fairly well written. They flow really well. And so this is just the actual like writing of the book, the prose. I'm hesitant to even use the word prose because there like wasn't any. It's hard for me to like describe the experience of reading this book because there truly was not a prose. There is not anything for me to describe to you because there was not anything above the bare minimum of what you needed to get you through the chapter with the understanding of what happened. It was very choppy. I don't really need super like flowery language, but I need a book to flow. And it was very just like, I went here, I went there, this is what happened, Four did this, I said this, I saw this on the wall, this was sitting on the floor. All right, if we turn to page 165, the opening paragraph I actually think is really good. It's really interesting, but it's also a good example of what I mean. There is one mirror in my house. It is behind a sliding panel in the hallway upstairs. Our faction allows me to stand in front of it on the second day of every third month, the day my mother cuts my hair. So that as an opening paragraph I think is really great. Actually, I'm not criticizing that as a paragraph, but you'll notice how it's very like, there's one mirror in my house. It is behind a sliding panel in the hallway upstairs. Our faction allows me to stand in front of it on the second day of every third month, the day my mother cuts my hair. It's just very like, I sit on the stool and my mother stands behind me with the scissors trimming. The strands fall on the floor in a dull blonde ring. When she finishes, she pulls my hair away from my face and twists it into a knot. I note how calm she looks and how focused she is. She is well practiced in the art of losing herself. I can't say the same of myself. I sneak a look at my reflection. You see what I mean? It's just very like, da, 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 da. It's not just plain. It's plain and choppy. It doesn't flow. And I almost feel like reading it out loud covers some of that because there's a certain element, like I can add a flow to the words that isn't there when you're just reading it. But there were so many points in the book where I really, like I knew I was reading a book and I felt like I was reading a book. It was rare for me to have a movie playing in my head. The book was words on a page. You know what I mean? She also is a big fan of this like triple repeat sort of motif. Help, I sob and scream, insensible, illogical, I am dying, I am dying, I am dying. And there's like a semicolon in between all three of those I am dyings. It was cool the first time she used it. I thought it was nice. And then the second time she used it, I was like, oh, she likes to do that. And then she did it like 7 more times before the end of the book. A unique motif like that is something you have to be very careful using multiple times because the journey for the reader is very similar to what I went through, which is like, oh, that was cool, that was impactful, like in this moment. And then the next time it happens, it's like, oh, I've seen this before. And then the time after that it happens, it's like, oh, I've seen this again. And it just like, the more you use the same trick over and over again, the more the reader is going to be like, oh, I've seen this. And it kind of like loses its impact. Those sorts of special like moments and motifs are supposed to be used to emphasize like the most important point in a book. And if you use it that many times, then it just completely loses its power. So that was something else I noticed. Buckle up for this one, folks. We're on page 380. We walk to the pit and up the path that leads to the glass building. I look up the glass ceiling. I can't see daylight because the soles of the shoes cover every inch of glass above us. For a second, I think I hear the glass creak, but it is my imagination. I walk up the stairs with Christina, and the crowd chokes me. That paragraph is 5 sentences. In the first 4 of those sentences, we use the word glass as a descriptor. The glass building, the glass ceiling, every inch of the glass creak. Like, 4 sentences in a row, the word glass. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know how normal that is for young adult, but I feel like, did an editor not read this? I don't mean to be harsh, but it's like, did nobody read this and say, hey, babe, you used glass 4 times in 4 sentences in a row? Like, and I'm not even usually like nitpicky about the reuse of words like in back-to-back sentences, but when it's 4 times, like I'm gonna notice. Like, that's something that freshman year English teacher would mark off on somebody's essay. Like, I don't understand. It just pulls you out of the reading experience and it reminds you that you're reading a book and it makes it hard to just like flow through the chapters. Reading this was like a real slog. It felt like work. I was interested in the plot, but the book itself wasn't carrying me through it. I had to really like intentionally make the decision to read and like really work to like form the pictures in my head through some of the chunky words. And I just like didn't really enjoy the reading experience. And then just a reminder that there was that like giant plot hole. It's, in my opinion, it was a plot hole where she's like very obviously manipulating the simulations in her final test, but we were explicitly told that doing exactly that would get her caught for being a divergent. So I thought the movie had potential, because if my big issue with this book was the writing, then if it's the same story but we're not dealing with the choppy writing, then maybe I'm actually going to end up liking the movie better than the book. So with that, let's turn our attention to the Divergent movie. It came out in 2014, and the very first thing I noticed about it was exactly how star-studded this cast was. I already mentioned Zoe Kravitz and Miles Teller. I was shocked. I did not remember they were in this movie. Those are both very well-known movie stars at this point in time. Based off of my research, I don't think they were very famous at the time that this movie came out, so maybe this movie was a bit of like a breakout role for both of them. Shailene Woodley plays Triss, and Theo James plays Tobias. That is a very attractive man. I don't really have very much more to say on him except for that. I was like very distracted by how beautiful he was through the whole movie. And Shailene Woodley was like the teen it girl of the time. She was also in The Fault in Our Stars. So you can imagine my shock when Ansel Elgort, her co-star in The Fault in Our Stars and her boyfriend in that movie, walks out as her brother in this movie. Now listen, I know they're actors. I know they're playing characters. There's nothing actually weird about this. They played siblings in one movie. They played love interests in another. It's not that strange. It's just that I didn't know he was in this movie. So there was a moment when I'm like kind of watching the early scene and I'm like kind of thinking about Shailene Woodley and The Fault in Our Stars and like this era of my life and my like teen years. Like I remember this pretty vividly, only for like Ansel Elgort to walk out and be like, "Hey sister." It just surprised me. I just was like, well, that threw me a little bit. Okay, I guess he's her brother in this movie. But the other thing is, and I don't know if these actors are like actually famous or if I just happened to watch every procedural TV show that each of these actors was on, but I felt like every single scene some new actor came onto screen that I like knew from something. And so I felt like this cast was so star-studded. But again, based off of my research, I actually think that a lot of them kind of had their careers made by this movie. So it's just an interesting experience in hindsight. So Tony Goldwyn is an example. He was on Scandal. Ansel Elgort, I already mentioned. Maggie Q, I didn't even know her name, but I did watch Nikita. That one's such a niche one. I don't know if you guys watched Nikita, but I loved that show. And so when she came out, I was like, whoa, hey Nikita, what's up? And then okay, I might butcher this. Mekhi Phifer, forgive me if that's not correct. I recognized him, and then I opened his IMDb to figure out where I recognized him from, and I had to scroll so far down. He was on a show called Lie to Me. I loved Lie to Me when I was in high school. I watched the shit out of that show. And that came out before this. So that's where I'm saying I don't know if like I just happened to like, I watched Scandal, I watched Nikita, I watched Lie to Me. So I just like happened to know all these actors, or if they had their careers made by the movie, or if some of them were more better known when the movie was being made and they like cast a more star-studded cast because they thought it might be like the Hunger Games. And then Kate Winslet came out and I was like, what on earth is going on? Why is Kate Winslet in this movie? So that distracted me for a large chunk of it because I was just so amazed by how they got such a talented cast for this. And again, my only assumption is that most of them weren't the talent that they are now when they made the movie. But going back to what I said of if they got all the same cast to make the fourth movie that they were intending on making, I think it would actually do really well now because of how famous these people are. But I have no idea how much money that would end up costing, because there's no way they were this expensive when they were making this first movie, or else this budget would have been like insane, you know? But my main notes for the movie are, I actually did really enjoy it. I do think there were moments where the dialogue was kind of choppy, but a lot of the times that I felt like the dialogue was choppy, they were actually kind of ripping dialogue direct from the book. I usually appreciate when movies are showing scenes that happen in the book and they just take the conversation the characters had in the book and they put it on screen. That's usually a good thing. When the writing of the dialogue in the book is good, that's a good thing. But there were moments where they were saying things and I'm like, I recognize that line from the book and I low-key think you should have changed it. The actors did their best with what they were handed, and in fact, Peter was probably one of my least favorite characters in the book, not just because he's a jerk, but because I don't think he's all that realistic. I talked about this a ton over my Fourth Wing series, but anybody who's just like evil for the sake of being evil and like every interaction they have with everyone around them is just them being gross is somebody who's like kind of unrealistic to me. Peter was that character in this book. He's just like evil and gross the whole time, and I just did not find him to be realistic, only to watch the movie and feel like Miles Teller did such a good job playing him that he felt like a realistic character. And it's not that the character changed that much, I just think he's that good an actor that I actually was like, oh, okay, I feel like I can see how this person would exist now in a way that I didn't see how they could have existed in the book. So I really liked the movie. I also felt like the romance was like slightly better developed only because they had so much on-screen chemistry. In the book, it very much was like they're hanging out a little bit and she maybe has the tiniest crush on him, and then they kiss kind of out of nowhere, and then they're just like boyfriend and girlfriend kind of out of nowhere after that. And like I said, that's very like teen love, young love, so I wasn't that mad about it. Whereas in the movie, I feel like because they could have like tension between the actors, even if the words they're saying have nothing to do with flirting, and they could be like physically closer to each other and having little moments where they like brush their hand on the other, whatever it might be. By the time the romance came about, it felt a lot more developed, and it just felt less out of nowhere, I guess. Not that the romance in the book was out of nowhere, because again, the whole time it's like, you know, she's gonna end up in a relationship with Four, but I don't really feel like it was actually developed. That's all I'm saying. So I honestly like kind of thought the movie was better than the book. Don't kill me. I'm sorry. That is how I felt. But again, I'm reading it as an adult. I'm not the demographic for this book, so maybe that's why. But I found it so hard to read, and so when they took basically the same plot and they just turned it into a movie, I enjoyed the movie a lot more than I enjoyed the book, because I wasn't having that like slog of like reading all the writing in this, if that makes sense. So as of right now, I find myself disagreeing with the feeling that the movies ruined the books. However, based on my initial research, people very much feel like the first movie was okay, and the second and third movies were the ones where they really tanked. So for all I know, I'm going to read these next two books and feel similarly to them about how I feel for this one, and then watch the movies and be like, oh, they made it worse. I don't know. I've only read the first book, I've only watched the first movie, but at least how I feel right now, I feel like the movie is actually a pretty fair adaptation of the book, and I feel like they made it better. Just a little bit. What do you guys think? Do you remember reading this? Were you a fan of it? Were you not a fan of it? Have you read it recently? Have you watched the movie recently? That's gonna be all for me today. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!